Anna and to Jeremy and to the Royal College of Art for bringing me indeed back here. This is almost home at this point for me. And I am so excited to be able today to talk about something that is not my usual area of comfort or comfort zone, which is a different scale from the one that I usually occupy, the scale of the city and the scale of the world. This city is mine takes its suggestion from a pretty corny movie from 1943 called This Land is Mine, which was a Hollywood take on Nazi occupation somewhere, a small city somewhere in Europe. That's how the movie actually started. But the idea was really an idea of like owning your city, owning your land. And what I argue with you today, what I would like to argue with you today, discuss with you today, is a new idea of ownership and responsibility that citizens have towards their city, and that pushes them to become creative. This morning we heard some really great presentations, and Jeff in particular talked about the Mayor's Award that was won by, amongst others, a small city here in England that probably was pushed by necessity to become particularly creative. I think that we find ourselves as citizens today in a moment of urgency and indeed emergency of many different kinds, some positive, some negative, that push us to become more creative. We are also empowered for good and for bad by local authorities, whether they are too pressing and too present in our lives or totally absent. But to make a long story short, it's a moment in which we are at the center of things together with the authorities that we have elected that are closest to our scale of occupation of our city. And that's what I think is particularly interesting. The idea of sharing and responsibly occupying a city. Creative Citizens, the logo, takes a little bit after the Creative Commons logo, I dare say, and wonderfully so. Only in Creative Citizens, the eyes really highlight the observation, the idea that observing and learning from reality then stimulates creativity, which is one of the tenets of design. But Creative Commons really is a great way to learn about the present and about the future. You know, its story, the attempt to really embrace the way we want to live today by making sure that we can use images and texts that are important to everybody, and having this ambiguous, ambivalent state between a copyrighted material and something that is in the public domain is pretty much the way we want to live. This morning I was talking about the B companies, B corporations, which is a relatively new concept that is now quite current in the United States for companies, for instance, like Warby Parker, and some other companies that are private corporations making profits and having shareholders, but also declaring public interest and a work towards the public good, which they have to document to the authorities every single year. This ambivalent state of private public, of common good, private good, is something that I think we should embrace. Ambivalence, ambiguity, a scale indifference, living in between and being able to merge our worlds, whether they are physical and digital, whether they are private or public, is really bringing about a different idea of ownership, and not anarchy, but rather trust. I think that the concept of trust is what we find most viable in our way of living together in cities and in the digital realm. You know, cities are based on the rules of cohabitation that are as old as humankind. No matter how much you regulate, courtesy and the ability to live together is what makes cities special. I'm from Milan, and I'll tell you an anecdote. I've been in New York for 20 years. I remember once, after many years that I had been living in New York, going to Milan, entering some fashion stores in the center of Milan, being addressed in English once, another store twice, another store thrice, until I realized that something was odd, and I asked, "Why are you talking to me in English? I am Italian, I'm from Milan." And the attendant said, "Sorry, you were smiling." So I think that what makes New York so special is that, and you might have noticed, you cannot walk park in New York and look sad without somebody kindly, not to pick you up like a Roman guy, is going to ask you what's wrong and try to talk to you. I think that this kind of basic human courtesy, which, believe you me, did not really exist before 9/11. It's been brought about by the World Trade Center debacle, is what makes today New York special. And other cities have different ways for things to work out or not to work out. I want to move from this idea of human courtesy to an idea that is more design and is more infrastructure-like. The idea that unscripted space that is crowd-probed and that has a fractal geometry-like indifference to scale is what we should try to envision our cities to be in the future. Let me explain it a little better. A year from the day that Occupy Wall Street started, Richard Sennett, who you might know, he's a sociology here at the London School of Economics, and he also teaches in New York, tried to kind of take stock of what had happened in the year before. And he talked about the fact that Occupy had really changed in people's minds and in people's imagination the balance between public and private. It was a very well-organized movement that, however, was organized on some kind of branding principles taken from Adbusters in particular that made it so that it was very mediatic but not political enough. So in some parts of the world it was completely defanged by the reality because it was too much about communication and not enough about physical protest. Nonetheless, it really brought about also a very important principle that, according to Sennett, goes, what the nation gives the people, the freedom that nation give people, are taken away often by cities. Indeed, you know, as Jeff was saying this morning, sometimes democracy is one of the biggest breaks and is one of the biggest ways to stop innovation and to stop this kind of ambiguous space. Why? Well, rules are needed, and sometimes protests are more vehement when rules are more strict and more totalitarian, as we have seen in other ways of occupation of space. This is a symbol of the Arab Spring. This is the blue bra that this scholar from the University of Cairo, Bahia Shihab, transformed into a tag for urban spaces. You know, it's taken from the iconic picture of the woman dragged by the police in Tahrir Square until she was almost naked and just revealing a blue bra. The protests that happened in the past few years have really shown how public space is back to what it used to be, a square, what it used to be when I was growing up, and when you were growing up, some of you also, which was really a place where worlds got upended and things really got changed. This is an image from Taksim Square instead. I particularly like, this is a design touch that you might like the co-opting of detergent bottles and filling them with milk so that they would become a way for people to protect themselves from tear gas. So it's kind of jolting. I am right now running a program on design and violence online. You can find it. And these kind of objects are also there. So Taksim Square, Tahrir Square, or even in 2013, the protests that happened in Brazil that also had enormous creative potential. You've seen the blue bra in Egypt, and then in Taksim Square, the co-opting of design objects. And in this particular case, this kind of spontaneous exhibitions of really overt pictures of like citizens' testimony of what the police was doing that were displayed on walls around the city in Sao Paulo. So it really is interesting because citizens come together to try and really upend the status quo by using what they have at their disposal, which is an occupation of public space. And what is being a citizen today under these circumstances? You know, I always go back to the classics, to Aristotle. Aristotle defined a citizen as somebody that has to work towards the common good. A citizen is somebody whose happiness coincides with the happiness of many, which is a very idealistic concept that was maybe possible in Athens, but already starts to falter when you have diversity within a community and interests diverge or go in different directions. So it becomes really complicated. And in fact, what happened in Rome was that only few could be citizens. Being a citizen was a privilege. It meant being able to participate in the Senate. It meant being able to vote. So in a way, This kind of hierarchy of belonging in the public realm is something that we envision also today, what with all the immigration policies all over the world and the divisions that are happening everywhere. And we see them even today. We're seeing what's happening. You know, it's so hard to be here and talking with what's going on in Scotland. You know, even though I'm Italian, I feel the shivers down my spine. So the common good is a concept that is a little hard to envision today unless we're able to rise above by going back to some very primal kind of needs and interests. But I also like this definition by Thomas Jefferson. I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves. The dream of true democracy, also so hard to achieve and yet always there for us to aspire to. So citizens are people that have both duties and responsibilities and rights. You know, I haven't gone through this yet. I will become a citizen sooner or later, but it feels such an important move for me that I haven't been able to do it yet, even though I've been in the US for 20 years. But you see, the rights are the freedom to express yourself, to worship, you know them all. I like the responsibilities, support and defend the Constitution. In the United States, the Constitution is taken very seriously, almost too much so. It's almost like a sacred text that is interpreted and misinterpreted in many different ways. Stay informed of the issues affecting your community. Participate in the democratic process, kind of vague. Respect and obey federal, state, and local laws. So the regulation, respect the rights, beliefs, and opinion of others. Participate in your local community, and that's where I see the valve of freedom. Pay income, yeah, of course, taxes, honestly. Serve on a jury when called upon. Defend the country if the need should arise. So all this is very old-fashioned, and it's the local community that provides so much openness. I mean, I'm a designer, so I like to have constrictions and one little valve because that's where you have the best geysers and the best fountains. But it really is interesting because it's about trying to understand whether the design of a citizen's life comes from above or from below or from the sides. Once upon a time, it seemed that being a citizen was quite clear, even during the revolts of the 1960s. You know, I'm thinking always of radical architecture and radical design. They had such vision for what we were supposed to be. But you see, at the beginning of the 60s, the visions were kind of devoid of human beings. So you had the walking city, you had the marine city, and it's only after 1968, you see there, the super studio 1969, that the city, the idea of living together in the future becomes really human-centered. But it's quite clear. It's almost like hippies. It's like the collective. It's everybody together sharing everything, free love, free food, and everything in the middle and in common. Today, that is not really possible anymore. But what I find really interesting is the idea of having access for all citizens at all scales. Let me explain a little better. When I did this exhibition in 2008 called Design and the Elastic Mind, I tried to revise the idea of scale that we have had as designers, architects, and as human beings for quite a while. The idea of scale that was represented, for instance, by The Powers of 10, the movie by Charles and Ray Eames, which sees a little bit like the space like an hour clock, where you can go powers of 10 from the universe until you reach human beings, and then inside human beings microscopically until you reach the atom and beyond. I believed that the idea of scale has changed, and that today scale is defined not anymore by dimension, but rather by complexity, by the intensity of the complexity of the systems. So what you see here is the section of the large maximum scale in the exhibition, which examines at the same time and with the same attention phenomena that are cosmic and phenomena that are instead very pointillistic, that are instead inside intimate spheres of human beings. But in particular, I commissioned a project called New City, and I commissioned it to an architect, Greene, some special effects specialists, imaginary forces, and a really great production designer, Alex McDowell, who did also Minority Report. So we were gearing towards the realm of science fiction a bit. But what I told them is that ideally I would have liked to have a new platform like Second Life. Are you all familiar with Second Life? Because it's kind of passé, but a world that would be better than Second Life because it would be democratic in that everybody would have access to all scales, which didn't happen in Second Life. Immediately, it came to represent and to imitate First Life, and therefore it had velvet ropes and tacky places where you couldn't go. And instead, people could access any recess and any detail, but not everybody could design. So the design part, the design aspect, was instead democratically judged by a jury of peers, so that everybody would have access to the best that human beings could produce. So it was this kind of idealism that was at the same time Aristotelian and Roman, and also was up to date with the technological possibilities of today. Was it successful? Not really. I mean, maybe it was beautiful, it was fun. People would lie down in the cave and go up and down in scale in the universe, but it still maintained the formalism of a sci-fi movie. But nonetheless, it was interesting to at least attempt to define the set of criteria that this kind of democracy of access and instead aristocracy of design would represent in a future world, digital world. Today, this idea of indifference of scale is represented in the work of so many architects, and I'm showing you only two groups here, but we could go on forever. It's the so-called parametric architecture. Skylar Tibbetts is at the MIT Media Lab, and he works on the idea of crystallization. And instead, on the right-hand side, you have Ben Aranda and Chris Lash. And in the background, a work by Aranda Lash that was also commissioned for Design in the Elastic Mind, which was based on a nanostructure that had 6 facets. So they looked at this nanostructure and they constructed this bas-relief, which could be ideally either the plan of a city, or it could be a facade, or it could be a microscopic or macroscopic view of human inhabitation. Once again, we're back to powers of 10, but complexity is what dictates. And both architects and designers are trying to get to the holy grail of organic design, which is to have structures that build themselves, that grow in harmony with human needs and with nature. Is that possible at the scale of the city? Not yet, but mayors definitely are trying to go in that direction. This is a scheme for Curitiba. Curitiba is a city in Brazil that had this very enlightened mayor a few years ago. His name is Jaime Lerner, and he is an architect. He was amongst the first to really think of infrastructure as the panacea, or a way at least to jumpstart a renewal of the city by connecting neighborhoods. It's a little bit like improving the blood flow to the limbs. There are neighborhoods, especially in cities in Latin America, that are almost forgotten, where people that really are destitute live. And one of the reasons why they remain destitute is because they're not connected to where the jobs are and to where actually money is made and life is lived. And so by connecting all of these different sectors to the center, or to the various centers of cities, several mayors, especially in Latin America, have been able to really change the destinies of cities and to teach a lot to the so-called first world, that means us. Why? Probably because of what Jeff said, because they were really in trouble and because they had to do so. So the famous turtle scheme that has become Jaime's signature is well known to most people that work at the level of infrastructure. Bogota went through a similar process. Another mayor, Enrique Peñalosa, decided to create all these urban parks by filling in, for instance, of using the bed of a river that was already there. And also one of the main innovations was this Transmilenio, this bus system that you see did not need the infrastructure of a subway or an elevated line that would cost too much money, but still it was kind of isolated from the car traffic, thus enabling rapid transportation at very low cost throughout Bogota. not to mention Medellin, another mathematician. What I also find, mayor that was not a politician. What I find really interesting is some of the best mayors are non-politicians. He was a mathematician in this case. So in Medellin, okay, we have the trains, we have a transmillennial-like bus systems, but we have the Metrocable that is the most innovative and most imitated system. The Metrocable you see here connects favelas. I mean, I'm using the Brazilian name, but they are barrios. They're like favelas. They're bad neighborhoods. And it's funny, usually the worst neighborhoods tend to have, also in Rio de Janeiro, the best views because they're in the most impervious parts of town. So it connects these barrios with the center of town in a very cheap and very fast way. Such no-brainers, right? But sometimes the simplest solutions come to those who really take perspective and take a step back and look at things at a large scale while at the same time they're able to keep their heart at the local scale. Something funny about scale happened at the Biennale of Architecture along some years. You see here a view of the Biennale from 2006. It was Ricky Burdett from the London School of Economics that directed it. It was great. It was devoted to the city. It was called Cities, Architecture, and Society. But the interesting part about it is that it always remained aesthetically fabulous, you know, almost like seeing pictures of the Earth from the moon, but it never really got to the people. So it was always this kind of infrastructure, almost as an abstract painting, this idea that you can really apply laws of physics and laws of geometry to the city from above. Just a few years later, 6 years later actually, the Golden Lion of the Biennale of Venice went to this representation of a very interesting inhabitation system in Caracas. You probably already know about Torre David. Torre David is a bank building that was begun and then never finished by the bank that went bankrupt and just let it go, and that is now inhabited by squatters. And at the Biennale of Venice, there was this cafe that was inspired by the Torre David, and it won actually it won the Golden Lion by showing this idea of spontaneity and occupation. This is how Torre David really looks, and these are photos by Juan Ban. Those of you who have seen Homeland, the TV series might have seen also some interpretation of it, but it's really quite an amazing spontaneous intervention. I mean, it's a city within a city. It's a favela that is completely vertical, and it's what won the Biennale that year. So 6 years of distance in such a completely different way to think of the city. It reminds me of this beautiful project by Rob Walker and Ellen Susan that is called the Hypothetical Development Organization. It's this idea of taking buildings, in this case in New Orleans after Katrina, and readapting them to new interesting uses. So the fact that people can just occupy buildings as they see fit is of course anarchy. It's an anarchy that might be necessary in some places, but that might be encouraged and redirected in others. So you've seen this moving from the global to the very local in the evolution of the Biennale, and you see here this is the work of Aram Bartol. It's a series of like Google pin drops that says you're really here, hyper-local, nowhere else. So the hyper-local is what politicians, I like this because he looks like a pin drop himself, politicians need to aspire to. This man you see here is my beloved friend Tom Finkelpearl, that used to be the director of the Queen's Museum. You see that he's in the diorama of New York that is at the Queen's Museum. If you've never seen it, please do go. The next time, it's that scale, New York at that scale. You see that he's wearing the covers for his feet. And he was very, very outspoken when he was director of the Queen's Museum. He dropped art from the museum's name so that people wouldn't be off-put and so that he wouldn't use models that were Manhattan models. He decided to not care anymore about the people of Manhattan that wouldn't cross bridges and instead to focus on the people of Queens that are, believe you me, really much more interesting. And so much so that now he's become the culture commissioner of the city of New York. So I see him really as being the pin drop. Right now, he has to go and drop himself as a pin in different parts of the city and empower people and let them know that what they're doing in that particular place creates a network of extreme power. This is what is happening, for instance, also in Chile. Chile has a very interesting system whereby the government gives each citizen that needs it a subsidy, a once-in-a-lifetime subsidy to buy a starter home. Let's say the home costs $20,000, as this one does. The government might give the citizen $19,500. The citizen has to put at least the $500 because there needs to be a personal investment. And then he or she gets this three-dimensional canvas of a building, a two-floor building, 2 or 3 floor building that is already organized around a cul-de-sac. It's the starter point of a community. People can add verandas, they can add balconies, they can add gardens, and then buildings add to each other. And believe you me, this is the work of architects. You know, usually architects are such egos, they would never, ever let something just go to the community and people interpret it. And instead, here you go, it's elemental. That's what they've been doing. So different system to jumpstart. So instead of planning the infrastructure like Baron Haussmann and seeing things from above, it's about jump-starting and it's about sparking innovation, as Jeff was speaking about this morning. Cities do it in many different ways. They also do it by stimulating the makers culture that children are so drawn to. You see, the Next Top Makers is a program that the city of New York is running. I've been on the jury twice already. It's so interesting. Everybody can submit, and they get a subsidy to initiate the company that they want to initiate. And instead, another veteran of this kind of jump-starting programs is the Waag Society in Amsterdam. That's the building, believe it or not. It's really quite gorgeous. Which started in the 1990s to teach people to use the internet, and now teaches people to do both 3D printing and high-tech making, and also low-tech crafts making. At the Biennale of Venice of 2012, when Torre David won the Golden Lion, the American Pavilion was all based on spontaneous intervention. It was a collection of citizen-led interventions in the territory that were about exactly the creative citizenry that we're talking about today. To give you an example of what was represented there, we had the classic Cyclic Fix, which is one of many different apps that we find in different places in the world that allows citizens to tell the government that there are potholes or things to be fixed, or this garden registry in San Francisco that allows people that have fruit or vegetable gardens to share overproduction of their vegetables amongst each other, or this kind of situationist app, which is an app that helps you traverse the city and use the city in ways that you wouldn't have planned before. There are so many different ways for citizens to be creative. And as I'm speaking to you right now, a very good friend of mine, a super young friend from New York, is speaking at the V&A about his work in the city. He has started this, it's almost like a Flickr, but with videos about the city of New York, and people take 1-minute videos of certain blocks, and it becomes this incredible diorama of the city seen in these very intimate ways. Data sets are very important and eternally stimulating. They allow citizens to reveal the invisible and to point out different aspects of the city that would otherwise remain completely unseen. This is a famous series of maps of different cities that is called Locals and Tourists. And in a way, by taking pictures from Flickr and using an algorithm that sees over time how many pictures are taken of the city and where, it kind of tells you where locals tend to take the most pictures and where tourists tend to take the most pictures. So in a way, it enables you to go and see the city like locals. You know, it's very interesting because it's like a clin d'oeil way to see it, as opposed to going and looking at Yelp or other sites that explain it verbally. It's also a beautiful series. Or Walking Papers, you know, this kind of intimate citizen-led discovery of the city. Walking Papers is based on open maps. That is one of the open source mapping systems that are available to everybody. And in this case, you by hand take notes on the maps to see what's wrong, or you want to add a pizza shop that is particularly good, and then you fax it in to Stamen, which is a company in San Francisco that uploads it onto the open map system. It's kind of crazy and beautiful and post-digital at the same time. They are upgrading it right now so that you don't even need to write anymore. Other ways to have an intimate understanding of the city sometimes is by smell. This really says it all. It's the work of Cecil Tolas, a great smell artist, that takes maps of cities based on how the cities stink in different parts. You know, this is a map of Berlin that you see up left that she made using this headspace technology that captures scents while they are alive. And it's a technology that is used in the scent industry. But also, data sets are a way for citizens to reveal truth to power. I love this work that is also in the collection of MOMA. It takes data that is publicly available that talks about how much money the local or federal government spends for certain blocks in cities of the United States to keep the inhabitants either in prison or in halfway houses. So it's almost like a financial measure of entropy, of social entropy. It's about people being taken out of society. And you see the brightest reds are the places where the city spends more than $1 million a year. There are blocks, you see Brooklyn there. And there's more than 350 blocks in Brooklyn alone. So you could read this data in a newspaper in the morning and be outraged for 20 minutes by the figures because they are so huge, but then you would forget. Once you see blood red over black, and that's the map of Brooklyn, and you bring it home and it's visual, it remains engraved in your mind. So it's a propaganda instrument, and design based on data sets that are publicly available is a way to really make certain data evident. As you can see also here, you know, also cities have changed. So the area between Tijuana and San Diego, the borderline between Mexico and the United States in that part of California, is considered almost like a spread city. But it's a spread city that has an enormous division, so much so that on the Mexican side of the border, there's almost like a spontaneous community and a spontaneous economy that is based on the fact that sometimes people have to wait 2 hours to cross the border. And these tracks by Toro Lab, it's a great company, it's a great architectural and artist studio in Tijuana, mark the moves of 5 people that legally cross the border every day because they work on the other side of the border. So once again, it's about, you cannot see the detail here, it would be over time, but you see the delays, you see the kind of annoyances, you see the disparities, how much money is made, how much time it takes. It's a way to really make things very clear and to make the invisible visible. This is another very funny diagram. There's a number in New York, 311, that was instituted by Mayor Bloomberg that allows citizens to call the city. So you can call the city and complain about different things. So you see here the calls to 311 at different times of the day, and you know, at night it's particularly noise. During the day, instead, it's potholes and other things. So you see what New Yorkers get mad about during the day. It's quite interesting. So how citizens speak to the city. Not all ways to make the invisible visible have to be digital. There's also very exquisitely analog ways. This is the work of Electroland, which is a company in Los Angeles, and they distribute it to homeless people. You know, there's so many homeless people in Los Angeles. In Santa Monica in particular, it's called the Social Republic of Santa Monica because the weather is so perfect, and the city is so socially minded that they can stay there. But they distributed to homeless people these very, very bright shelters. Why very bright? Because they wanted to put homelessness in everybody's face. One of the problems with homelessness is that it's so invisible. It's always like cast to the side. And instead, being able to really make it clear in a creative way is a means to an end. It's propaganda of a sort. Well, we've also seen how sometimes you want to make protests not only visible but audible. I went to look for a complaints choir because I thought it was so beautiful when he spoke about it this morning, and I found this. So the idea that citizens can stop at corners of street and don't even need a soapbox anymore, they just put it in song, is quite fabulous, I have to say. So creative citizens indeed, creative citizens that speak, that smell, that put together data sets, that protest, that occupy, and also that tag the city. How many times have we seen new ways to use the city as canvas, sometimes non-invasive one? This is the work of Troika, which is a company based in London. It's an old piece from 2003 that I still love. The idea that you can project onto public buildings and public signs. You can project your own tweets. And in that case, it was SMS. There was no Twitter yet. It was quite beautiful. Other non-invasive ways to tag the city, the homeless code, the homeless city guide, is a reprisal of the old hobo code that homeless people shared with each other. They would tag buildings to say where it was safe to go, where there was a dog, where the guardian was particularly pliant, where there was heat, where there was water. And there's this homeless city guide that's been picked up again by actually a British institution so that it can become a way for a particular community to navigate the city. Graffiti, of course, are by some considered a blight, by others considered a plus for a city. It's very interesting because in New York they've been almost completely eliminated except for artistic ones. Like really, there's a strange quality selection, natural selection that happened. And instead, for some reason, Milan has some of the worst graffitis all the time. You know, I would like to understand the psychology behind graffitis. In this case, Evan Roth is an American living in Paris who decided to make a taxonomy of graffiti. It's kind of a scientific experiment that does not have strict rules yet. So he's looking for rules as he goes, but he's been taking the same letter from different parts of the world and trying to understand how they're interpreted differently. It's an in-between calligraphy and urban tagging, but quite an important kind of study because he was also one of the people responsible for one of the most interesting pieces of technology lately, which is the laser tag by Graffiti Research Lab. It's a little old at this point, and you see on the right-hand side when I invited them to perform at MOMA, they have that kind of ideological thing. They want to be still outside of society, so fuck you, snobs. You know? I'm like, okay, on the atrium of MoMA, like, all right, no problems. But laser tag is a way to tag buildings with laser. So you use the building facade as if it were a screen, so much so that in order to delete your tag, you just have to kind of like point to the lower corner, lower right corner, and you delete everything. You might say, okay, this is performance, it's a boutade, they did it all over the world, and even though it doesn't damage any building, every time they show up, the police comes. So it's really interesting because it shows the knee-jerk reaction to certain kind of occupations of space or occupations of private versus public domain. But in reality, this technology was also very important because it enabled this amazing project that talks about public, private, ability, disability, and it also talks about the local and global. You see on the upper left corner, many of you might know it already, iWriter. It's quite a famous project. It's Tempt One that is paralyzed. He's a graffiti artist from LA. He's paralyzed in bed because he has ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. I don't think it's called, he's completely amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or, sometimes I get confused. But he's completely paralyzed. He used to be one of the greatest graffiti artists in LA in the 80s, particularly renowned for his calligraphy. He was one of the calligraphic taggers. And the group of hackers, engineers, and artists behind laser tag that was all coming from the I-Beam Institute in New York, decided to adapt the laser tag technology so that Tempt One could tag a building in downtown Los Angeles from his hospital bed. And what they did is they created this contraption that enables anybody, because but then it became an open source project, to create a script using the eyeball, just eyeball movements, and then send it remotely to the laser tagging machine, so that really the sense was one of filling in the scale difference and the distance and having that experience. So it's quite beautiful to think that technology enables us to fill gaps that are beyond time and space and to really use the city in a very different ways. Many designers and artists and coders are working on facetious, fun, but at the same time deep ways to use the city differently. This is the work of Area Code, a video game company now disbanded. It was bought by Zynga, and then Zynga went under, so it doesn't exist anymore. But this is a pretty really old work. You can see that it's old because it's a Motorola clamshell phone. You know, it's like, you know, the beginning of 24, Jack Bauer at the first year, maybe. And it's a video game that is played on the screen and in the real world. So the screen reflects where you are. In this case, it's a part of the West Village in New York. The little sun is you moving around. Actually, no, you are the yellow and the blue person. There's two people. The little sun is good. The skull is bad. The skull is Papa Samedi. It's a monster from New Orleans, from Mardi Gras. And it's following you and trying to eat you. And you see people here running for dear life, even though everything is just in the screen. Or you see here, you know, Reinhaus, this kind of like a room with a view. This is a Berlin group that, in a way, thinks of the city as a place to experiment in different ways. But of course, you know, we all need this kind of valve, and maybe museums can provide a valve. I've started a department of R&D at the Museum of Modern Art in 2012 to really think of museums as citizens, and we've had a few sessions that were exactly about that. In those sessions, we've been looking at the past. You know, this is the Triennale of Milan in 1968, a museum that provided a place for people to come and protest and really show their creative violence at that time, because the Triennale building was quite devastated. Or here instead, much calmer but still very powerful, the work of Federico de Moraes, that during the military occupation in Brazil created this series of creative Sundays for the people of Rio de Janeiro to come to the museum and find metaphors to express their political view, a little bit what's happening in China when people try to use other words in social media and social network to express their ideas. So museums become a place where this kind of community of coming together can happen. Of course, the Centre Pompidou was envisioned exactly to be like this, to be this kind of digestive gastrointestinal system of the community, a place where people, a place made for people to come together. Not a museum, not a building, not a place to hang paintings, a place for people to be together. A place for people to be together so that the way citizens approach the idea of making a city is not anymore like SimCity. It's not anymore about starting with a particular, which went by itself, starting with a particular view and then making it happen, but rather a place where you can have a strange new view of the city, a place in which the city is your own, but at the same time, it can go in many different directions depending on how you look at it. This is a visualization by Berg here and there that reminds us a little bit of the movie Inception, a place where ultimately you can have a completely new level of occupation, a completely new level of living together. I've always loved parkour, the so-called sport parkour, as a metaphor of the way we should live in the future. And I hope that museums will help us also move in that direction, as people already are. Thank you very much.
For questions, so if you'd like to stay up there.
Absolutely. Or comments.
I might just go this side. All right. I mean, does anybody have any questions to start off? Do you want to go first? Microphone down, second row.
Hello, thanks.
Hi.
That was very interesting and fascinating, actually. But there were two things that especially caught my attention when you were talking about infrastructures and complexity. And those two are quite difficult to bring together, really. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about maybe ideas or desires that you
Lately, a lot of collaboration is happening between scientists and designers and architects. And in particular, one collaboration that I'm familiar with is what's happening in Los Alamos between the Complex Systems Lab that Jeffrey West is leading and some architects in universities like Columbia University and Harvard. More and more, algorithms can help make sense of some complex systems, but at the same time, algorithms cannot be trusted completely. And this is something that comes to us from the complex systems theory. There needs to be some manipulation and adaptation. And I know that I'm not making things that much clearer, but the contamination amongst discipline is really helping, because it used to be that once upon a time infrastructure designers were engineers coming mostly from the civil engineering world, right? And instead now there's a lot of collaboration with biologists and with mathematicians that I think helps the argument. I'm always the worst I have intuitions of certain concepts, and I'm very bad at trying to explain them. That's why I do exhibitions, you know, that's why I use so many visuals. But in a way, the new city paradigm, that kind of sci-fi movie, was exactly that. An algorithm that was not as strict as a fractal geometry equation, but that adapted according to the position of the individual and the level of scale. The complexity, in other words, was not always the same level, but there was a law that enabled the difference in scale. Did I explain myself? Not much, huh?
No, I think it's a really quite rich subject.
Yeah, and it would take a completely different.
Also bringing the public space to it as well, which is sustained by infrastructures, but at the same time it's kind of perhaps maybe driven by certain complexity.
Absolutely, especially the complexity of private, you know, the common good versus the individual good.
Okay, anybody else? The back? John.
Thanks, a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
You mentioned Alex McDowell, and going back to something that was being discussed at the earlier plenary this morning, it is noteworthy that Alex McDowell has now become a full professor at USC, so
Sure.
there is a crossover between these worlds.
Absolutely.
But his name made me think of a question for you, which is, do cities have to be in places? Because he does something called world building, which puts the image of a city in our heads when we watch the movies that he's involved in, and he puts disciplines and ideas together in this kind of cinematic environment, which then leads to our rethinking what cities might be and what they might be like in the future. So is that part of your thinking too?
I think that places don't have to be physical. So I think that cities have to be in places, and the places can be digital. The idea of place is not necessarily a physical construct, but rather it's something that has personality, a location that has personality. So it depends on your comfort with digital space. I've always been very comfortable. I know that there are people that are not. And also it depends on the quality of the digital representation. I mean, when it's not good enough, it doesn't really work. But personally, I think, yes, cities have to be in places, but places don't have to be in the physical world. Because placemaking is such a big discipline that I think the idea of place, I don't want to give it away, give it up.
Ian Hargreaves.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'd just like to press you further on something you said about New York and New York since 9/11, and I think you were talking about its civic quality in some way, or the civic behaviour or the behaviour of people. Could you just tell us a bit more about that? I mean, because it's not something that you hear about these days. I mean, there was obviously in the short term there was a lot of talk about that, but you seem to be suggesting it's a longer running phenomenon and more significant.
It's a very personal reading of the situation, but to give an example, when I cross the street in London, and even if I'm on pedestrian walk and somebody stops, I tend to say thank you. Maybe because I'm happy that he didn't run me over as they might in New York. I don't know. Maybe it's just that kind of idea. But in the elevator, hello. I mean, I noticed in New York a level of courtesy that I don't notice elsewhere, and that is amazing if you consider how pressed we are together. And it's not only courtesy in terms of civility, it's also compassion and the attempt to have a human contact. And you might tell me, yeah, but that's completely superficial. The American way, you say, hello, how are you? But you don't really want to know how the person is. Okay, perhaps. But still, it is enough to make you feel that you're amongst human beings. And this is something, I've been living in New York since 1994, so I was already in New York for 7 years before 9/11. And 9/11 psychologically for the idea of community was quite amazing because we all went through the same thing, almost as if we had a connection, as if we were an iRobot. We all were synchronized in our emotions. Of course, there were people that were touched so directly that they were peaks outside of the statistic. But for 2 months, we were all paralyzed at home. Really, nobody wanted to speak about it. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And then around December 11th, a series of parties started happening. It was an extraordinarily warm December. It was beautiful weather. And there were parties, some small, some big, like, this is completely stupid, but the Prada store on Broadway was supposed to open September 11th, and also the Miyake building. There were all these people in New York because there were all these silly, even the MoMA store in Soho, the silly fashiony stores that were supposed to open 9/11. And they all ended up opening at the same time around December 11th, 12th, and people were out until 4 in the morning completely drunk. So it was almost like a bacchanalia. And then life started picking up again with an extraordinary amount of compassion for each other, I feel. I mean, really, and it hasn't gone away. Now, of course, this is a generalization, but when I tell people something corny, when they ask me what's their favorite place in New York, and I say the subway, I really mean it. Because I sit down and I start imagining the lives of other people around me, and I find personality in everybody's shoes and toenail polish. I don't know what it is. I think there really is a longing to be with other people in New York that I don't find in other cities in the world. Sorry, totally corny, I apologize. but it comes from real love for the city. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. And I think it offers a lot of, I don't know if you're interested in the Arab world, which is the region on which I work, but it offers so much insights on these policies of inhabitation of space in post-revolution and post-war Arab world. So that was really interesting for me. Thank you very much. I have a comment and a question. I kept waiting for an image from like Black Rock City or Burning Man. I felt there's gonna be an image of that city that rises in the deserts and disappears just a week afterwards. But again, the same kind of insight. My question had to do with the word propaganda, which you used 3 or 4 times. Did you actually mean propaganda, or you wanted to say activism, advocacy?
No, I meant propaganda. I meant, sometimes propaganda is an Italian word, so I hope that I'm using it with the same kind of nuances. But propaganda means, in my opinion, manipulating with an end, manipulating somebody's thoughts with some expression so that it goes towards an end. So I think I meant it in the real way. Of course, there was a lot of activism here, but when I was talking about the $1 million blocks, maybe I'm reacting to the toxic situation in the United States right now, which is really this paralysis of decision because there are 2 parti pris, especially one. So I'm always thinking of ways in which some truth can be shown in ways that are irrefutable, right? And maybe that's not propaganda, but maybe I use the word propaganda because I'm so desperate for people to get it that I'm willing to trick reality even just a little bit by using the blood red in order for them to get it. So is it right to use propaganda, or you feel it's wrong?
I wouldn't.
You wouldn't? Okay, thank you. I'll note it then. I'll be more aware.
Because the dominant use today of propaganda is in a completely different
Okay.
discourse.
Noted. Thank you very much. I will. No, it's sometimes there are these nuances with Italian that are, thanks.
I just wondered, thinking about Lewis Mumford's points about the museum as city, what you think the future and the role of the museum is in creative agency of its citizens.
The future role of museums, I think, has to change, and it has to become a place where people can talk about important matters. Art has to be a catalyst and an initiator. They will not do without art, but it has to be a place where even the word participatory, which is bandied around so much, is not enough anymore. I mean, I'm very proud of design and violence. I'm not going to delve on it here, but it's a project that started as an exhibition, but then the exhibition could not happen, so we did it online. And every week we publish a different object that has an ambiguous relationship with violence. So last week we published the so-called technical, which is the 4x4 that has become the symbol of guerrilla, civil war, narco-traffic, all over the world. And we always call upon an expert. In this case, it was a woman that had grown up in Sierra Leone to talk about it. And then at the end, we ask a question and people comment. And with that, we have been talking about euthanasia, we have been talking about the death penalty, we have been talking about eating animals. We've also had some public debates. Eating animals, we had the Temple Grandin's redesign of the slaughterhouse, and the founder of PETA, Ingrid Newkirk, wrote the essay. So that's what I hope museums will become. Taking into account, if you're an art museum, you have to take into account also aesthetics and form. And if something, you have to criticize it and to be critical about it. But for instance, what the V&A is doing with the immediate response collecting, I think is really interesting. So I wish it had more space to make it really known. They are a different kind of museum. I probably could not show some of the objects that are in their collection because I'm an art museum, but nonetheless, I think it's so important. And artists are really dying to talk about this. There's another blog that you might know already that's called Creative Time Reports, in which artists from all over the world write about political issues that are happening, so they don't write about their art. We have lost track of what art is, and this kind of closeness to life might bring it back to make it relevant, to make both art and museums relevant to society. If that doesn't happen, certain museums will always survive because they conserve the patrimony of humankind, British Museum, Louvre, etc. Some others that are very local give pride to a community, but all the in-betweens, especially the modern and contemporary art museums, will become really irrelevant if they don't salvage and hold dear this relationship with life.
Okay, we have time for just one more question. Perhaps Ola there at the back. Ola.
Hi, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could just perhaps comment on the juxtaposition between poverty and aesthetic values in a lot of your slides. Thinking about the one with the pods, for instance. And
with the what?
The slide featuring the pods and several others as well. There's a very stark juxtaposition between poverty and aesthetic values in several slides. And I was just wondering if there is a risk of prettifying homelessness. And I mean, there's design in itself might not be what has got an inherent good. I mean, there's a lot of design to keep homeless people out, for instance, if you think about the benches that we have debated here in the UK of recent. That's design too.
Absolutely.
So I was just wondering if you have thought about that.
I try to always be mindful, especially on the design and violence side. The idea of aestheticizing violence or aestheticizing poverty is such a danger, and I'm sure that sometimes I fall into it. In that particular case of the homeless shelters, that was not the intention at all. Or maybe it was, and maybe this aesthetic, you call it aesthetic, I call it bright colors, but sometimes the two come together, was a way to be a slap in the face. So the pod itself was designed in a very, like many, many other homeless pods. I mean, homeless shelters are one of the first exercises for so many architectural offices and students of architecture, because it's this idea of being in between architecture and design and being portable. It just is, it's like as attractive as chairs for design students. But in this particular case, the fact that it was so bright was the point of the whole exercise. I am sure that there are some cases in which there's this aestheticization. And also there are some lucky few cases in which a great formal expression or formal intention coincides with a purpose that is as elevated as can be. So the two kind of come together. So I think it's important to be mindful of not aestheticizing, but it's also important to be mindful of not always uglifying what is socially important.
All right, that's great. I think we have to finish there because we've got to go on
Thank
to our
you.
next session. But thanks very much,
Thanks a lot.
Paola.